There was something in the air back then, a certain lightness in how people walked down the street, how they spoke to one another, even how they looked at the sky, as if the whole country had taken a deep breath together and believed, just for a little while, that the future was theirs to shape. You could feel it in the music, drifting from radios, in the crisp uniforms of children, walking to school in the quiet pride, behind the counters of diners and corner stores. Everything seemed cleaner, newer, not just on the surface, but in the way people carried themselves. There was a sense that America was no longer just recovering from the war. It was becoming something more, something noble, something bold. And at the center of it all was a young man with a clever smile and windswept hair, who seemed to step out of a black and white photo and bring it to life. He had not yet changed the world, not yet spoken to the nation in its darkest hour. But people already leaned in when he spoke, already straightened their backs when he walked past. Not because of what he had done, but because of what they believed he could do. It was a moment balanced perfectly between what was and what might be. A country not yet grieving, not yet afraid, just standing still for a breath under the bright light of hope. The boy who ran against the world. Long before the motorcade, before the crowd in Dealey Plaza, before the broken cry from Walter Cronkite's lips, there was just Jack. Not the man on the coins or the marble walls, but the boy who lived in the shadow of illness, who spent long hours in bed with books because his body could not keep up with his dreams. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, in the spring of 1917, just as the United States was stepping into the First World War. The second of 9 children in a devoutly Catholic, fiercely ambitious family. His father, Joseph Kennedy, dreamed not just of wealth, but of power, the kind of power that could shape nations. And when his eldest son, Joe Jr., died in that Second Great War, it was Jack who inherited the weight of that dream. He was not built for it. He was sickly, racked by back pain, plagued by Addison's disease, long before the public ever heard the name. At Harvard, he was clever, not flashy. He wrote a thesis that turned into a best-selling book, Why England Slept, and yet he still seemed more boyish than presidential. His war record helped PT 109 gave him the story of a hero, but even that came with shadows. The Navy nearly discharged him. His back was never the same, and still he ran. In 1946, at just 29, he ran for Congress. 3 terms later, he set his eyes on the Senate. His style was soft-spoken, his charm unforced. While others thundered at podiums, he made people lean forward, listening. By 1952, he had unseated Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a pillar of the Republican establishment. That same year, he married Jacqueline Bouvier, the elegant debutante with a voice like smoke and posture like porcelain. Together they became something America had not seen before, young, graceful, golden. But behind the images were the bruises. In 1954, Jack nearly died after spinal surgery. He received the last rites of the church, twice. His recovery was slow, agonizing. He wrote another book, Profiles in Courage, dictated from his hospital bed. The book won the Pulitzer, though some whispered about ghostwriters. Still, the words belonged to him. The title fit. Then came 1960. It was a hard year, a close year. Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president, was no easy man to beat. He was cunning, seasoned, and ruthless. But Jack had something else, something Nixon never could summon. He had presence. On television, in the first-ever presidential debates, broadcast to millions of homes, Jack did not just look better, he seemed better. Calm, poised, clear. It was the moment the screen began to matter more than the paper. And Jack understood that even if he never said it out loud, he won by just over 100,000 votes. A breath, a blink. But it was enough. And so, on January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States, the youngest man ever elected to the office, the first Catholic. The boy who had spent months in a hospital bed now stood on the steps of the Capitol, the snow swirling gently around him, delivering a speech that still echoes across generations. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It was more than a line. It was a challenge, a promise, a dare to believe again. His presidency began like a sunrise. Peace Corps space race, new frontiers of civil rights. The children called it Camelot. Jackie, with her sense of theater, encouraged that name. And for a little while, America believed they were living in a fairy tale written in real time. But even the brightest dawn carries the seeds of its dusk. He had enemies. Southern Democrats snarled at his civil rights pushes. Generals grumbled that he was too soft on communism. The Bay of Pigs failed miserably. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly ended the world. He made mistakes, some of them deadly, but through it all, the country kept watching him, not because he was perfect, but because he seemed to carry the burden of imperfection with grace. And he was not done. In late 1963, as the election year loomed, he began to speak more boldly about civil rights, about poverty, about the need to change not just for votes, but for justice. He spoke of visiting the South, of winning Texas, of building bridges in places where people had only known walls. And so he traveled to Florida, to Georgia, to San Antonio and Houston, and then finally to Dallas. But that is for another night. A city waiting in shadow. By the fall of 1963, the president was restless. The air in Washington had grown thick with whispers about Vietnam, about civil rights, about the next election. But Texas was on his mind. He needed Texas. Not just its electoral votes, though those mattered. What weighed heavier was the crack forming in the Democratic Party, right along the Texas fault line. Liberal Democrats in the North, conservative Democrats in the South, they were drifting apart like tectonic plates. And in the middle stood Lyndon Baines Johnson, the vice president, a Texan through and through. Some said Jack never liked Johnson, that he picked him for balance, not brotherhood. But in November of 1963, they stood side by side on Air Force One, flying south into a state both proud and unpredictable. The plan was simple on paper. A 2-day tour with stops in San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. The president would speak, smile, wave, and remind Texans why they once called themselves Democrats. But Dallas was different. The city had a reputation by then, one that sat uneasily on its gleaming skyline. In 1960, just weeks before the election, then Senator Johnson had been spat on at the Adolphus Hotel by protesters accusing him of selling out the South. In October 1963, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was struck with a placard by angry demonstrators downtown. They called him a traitor, a coward. Some said the air itself in Dallas felt charged, like a storm gathering behind closed curtains. Still, the president insisted on the visit. Jackie would come too. It would be her first public trip since the loss of their baby boy Patrick, just a few months earlier. She was grieving, but she understood image. Her presence would soften the edges. The crowds would be larger, the welcome warmer. They arrived on November 21st. San Antonio first. The president delivered a speech at the dedication of the Aerospace Medical Health Center. He spoke about space, about the need to explore, to push beyond. Then Houston, where he and Jackie attended a banquet for Congressman Albert Thomas. The congressman raised a glass and winked. Jackie, in her pale pink suit, smiled. It was all going to plan. Late that night, the presidential plane touched down at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. The sky was dark, a little damp. A crowd waited anyway. The president waved, then vanished into the Hotel Texas, where he and Jackie would spend their final night together. The morning of November 22nd began early. A light rain fell outside their suite room 850. But inside, Jackie was laying out her signature suit, the one she had chosen deliberately pink, with navy trim matching pillbox hat. Jack teased her gently about her French style. She teased him back about his tie. At 8:45 a.m., he stepped outside the hotel for a short speech to a crowd gathered in the drizzle. He was bareheaded, his voice hoarse, but steady. "There are no faint hearts in Fort Worth," he said, "and I appreciate your being here this morning." Then, inside the hotel, he gave another talk at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. Jackie arrived a few minutes late to applause. The president looked at her like a man still slightly stunned by luck. By 11:00 a.m., they were back aboard Air Force One, heading the short flight to Dallas's Love Field. The rain had stopped. In fact, the sun broke through. That small detail changed everything. With clear skies, the bubble top on the presidential limousine, meant to protect against rain, was deemed unnecessary and left behind. It was not bulletproof anyway, but the symbolism mattered. The president wanted to be seen. He wanted to connect. At 11:40 a.m., the plane touched down. A large crowd gathered on the tarmac. Jack and Jackie emerged all smiles. She carried a bouquet of red roses, an unusual choice. In most Texas cities, the tradition was yellow. At 11:55 a.m., the motorcade began to assemble. The route was published in local papers. It would wind through downtown, past the Texas School Book Depository, before turning onto Elm Street and heading toward the Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to speak at a luncheon. In total, the journey would take about 45 minutes, long enough to be seen to wave to remind the people that this was not just a president. They were witnessing history in motion. Crowds lined the streets 10 deep in some places. They cheered. They waved signs. Children sat on shoulders. Elderly men removed their hats. A group of nuns clutched rosaries and smiled as Jackie passed. The city for that moment was golden. But up in the window of the Texas School Book Depository, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was watching too. A former Marine, a drifter, a Marxist. He had lived in Russia. He had defected. He had come back. And now he worked in the warehouse on Elm Street stacking textbooks for Dallas schoolchildren. What stirred in him on that morning, in that place, we may never fully know. But the stage was set. By 12:20 p.m., the motorcade had reached Main Street, curving slowly through the canyons of downtown. The president looked relaxed, chatting with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, who were seated in front of him. Jackie sat beside Jack, poised, graceful, calm. Then came the sharp turn onto Houston Street, then left onto Elm. The book depository loomed behind them. And then, but not yet. That moment when the world shifted was still 7 minutes away. And no one in that crowd, no one in that car, not even the man waiting in the 6th floor window, could have fully known how many things were about to break. The sound that froze the century. At exactly 12:29 p.m., the presidential motorcade glided down Elm Street, its wheels whispering over the asphalt, sunlight bouncing off the chrome edges. The streets of Dallas had never felt so alive. Thousands of people lined the sidewalks, waving, cheering, some holding little American flags that fluttered in the dry November breeze. Jackie sat in her seat, her gloved hands clutching the bouquet of red roses. She leaned slightly toward her husband, listening, as he nodded and spoke with Governor Connally. He had just leaned back and said, "No, you certainly cannot say that the people of Dallas haven't given us a nice welcome." And then at 12:30 p.m., time snapped. It came first as a sound, not a dramatic crash or a booming explosion, just a sharp, dry crack, like someone slamming two pieces of wood together. A firecracker, some thought. Others turned their heads toward the sound, confused. Jackie blinked. Governor Connolly started to twist in his seat. Then came the second shot. This one did not leave room for doubt. The president's hands jerked toward his neck. His elbows flared. He slumped forward. Jackie turned her eyes wide. Her mouth parted. Connolly was hit, too, crying out in pain. "They're going to kill us all." A third shot followed just seconds later. This time, there was no mistaking it. The president's head snapped back and to the left, a motion that would be replayed for decades in grainy frames. A motion that would become the most scrutinized moment in American history. Jackie lurched toward her husband. Blood. Bone. Fragments. The bouquet of red roses tumbled onto the floor of the limousine. Agent Clint Hill, riding on the bumper of the trailing Secret Service car, saw it happen. He ran forward, leaping onto the back of the limo, pushing Jackie back into her seat as she reached across the trunk in a daze, trying, perhaps without even realizing, to gather the pieces of her husband's shattered head. The motorcade for a second was frozen, and then it bolted. The driver, Secret Service agent William Greer, stomped on the gas. The limousine surged forward out of Dealey Plaza, away from the book depository, toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. The roar of sirens followed. Spectators screamed. Some hit the ground. Others pointed toward the window on the 6th floor, where they swore they saw movement. The nation didn't know it yet, but history had just cracked open. Back at the book depository, chaos broke loose. Police swarmed the building. Inside, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald had already hidden his rifle behind some boxes and slipped down the stairs. He was calm, unnervingly so. He even stopped to buy a Coke from the vending machine. Minutes later, he was gone. At 12:36 p.m., the limousine arrived at Parkland. Jackie refused to let go of her husband. Secret Service agents had to pry her gently from the car, her pink suit soaked in blood. Inside Trauma Room 1, doctors tried desperately to revive the president, but they knew. The damage was massive, irreparable, hopeless. At 1:00 p.m., Dr. Malcolm Perry emerged pale and shaken. He stepped into the hallway filled with agents' staff press and whispered the words that would echo across the country. "The president is dead." For a moment, silence reigned. No press conference, no trumpets, no ceremony, just shock. And then the world began to spin. Back in the hallway, Lyndon Johnson, who had been 3 cars behind in the motorcade, was told he would need to assume the presidency immediately. He looked stunned, as if the air had been knocked from his chest. He nodded slowly. "Let's get out of here," he said. Meanwhile, Jackie remained with Jack's body, refusing to leave. She stood beside the gurney, her hands still gloved, still stained. Her face was pale but eerily composed. When told they needed to take the body for an autopsy, she only said, "I'm not going without him." At 2:00 p.m., Air Force One was readied for departure. Jack's casket was loaded aboard against Texas law, but no one dared argue. Jackie climbed aboard too, still in the same blood-soaked suit. When asked if she wanted to change, she said, "No. Let them see what they've done." Inside the aircraft, in a cramped space near the rear, a Bible was found. A judge was summoned, and at 2:39 p.m., Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office beside Jackie Kennedy, who stood silent, stunned, as history turned its page. The plane lifted off moments later. Aboard, silence. No toasts, no celebration. Just quiet breathing and the low drone of engines as the body of the 35th President of the United States headed home. Back in Dallas, investigators began piecing together the chain of events. Witnesses pointed toward the book depository. police issued a description of a suspect. Within an hour, Oswald had been spotted in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. Officer J.D. Tippett, a Dallas patrolman, pulled over to question him. Oswald pulled a revolver and shot him dead. By 1:50 p.m., Oswald was in custody. He was calm, denying everything. "I'm just a patsy," he said. But the news had already broken, first on the wires, then over radios, and finally on televisions. From Dallas, Texas, the flash apparently official President Kennedy died at 1:00 p.m. Central Standard Time. The anchor Walter Cronkite paused, removed his glasses, struggled to keep composure. "Incredible," he said. And across the country, a generation held its breath. The streets fell silent. People pulled over their cars. In classrooms, teachers wept. Phones rang endlessly. Bars turned down their jukeboxes. In kitchens and living rooms, Americans stared at their black and white sets, not sure what to feel, except numb. Something had been torn open. Not just a life, not just a presidency, but something deeper. A sense of safety, a belief in order, a myth that this kind of thing did not happen here. But it had, and the questions had only begun. A nation suspended in grief. The plane touched down at Andrews Air Force Base just after 6:00 p.m. A cold wind was picking up, brushing against the gathered crowd of military men, Secret Service agents and dignitaries who stood waiting in grim silence. The rear door of Air Force One opened slowly. They brought the casket out first, plain bronze, heavy, with finality. Jackie followed, still wearing the same pink suit. The blood was drying now, darkening into rust-colored stains. She had not spoken much during the flight, just stared out the window, just held Jack's ring in her hand, turning it slowly, like it might wake him up. A Navy ambulance carried the casket to Bethesda Naval Hospital. There would be an autopsy, a security perimeter, arguments between local authorities and federal agents. But none of that mattered to the American people that night, because something far deeper was happening. Across the country, televisions glowed like vigil candles. Families gathered around the screen, holding hands, holding breath. Anchormen with trembling voices read updates as fast as they came in. There were no graphics, no theme music, just faces, pale, stunned, trying to make sense of it all. In New York, Broadway dimmed its lights. In Boston, church bells rang. In cities and small towns alike, people left flowers outside federal buildings. Strangers hugged in supermarkets. Teenagers wept without knowing exactly why. Even the weather seemed uncertain. Cold fronts stalled. Rain fell in patches. It felt like the sky itself did not know how to respond. On Sunday, November 24th, the president's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. It was the first time many Americans had seen such a thing on television. The casket sat atop a black catafalque draped in the flag, guarded by 4 silent soldiers. Thousands came. People stood in line for hours, in the cold, inching forward for a chance to walk past the casket and bow their heads. Some wept, some prayed. Some just stood there stunned that the face they had seen on campaign posters in newspapers, on live TV only days ago, was now gone. Little children clutched their parents' hands. Old veterans saluted. One woman collapsed from grief. The line kept moving, and then, even before the morning could settle, came another shock. That same Sunday morning, as police were preparing to transfer Lee Harvey Oswald from the city jail to the county facility, a man stepped out of the crowd. Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, a man known to police, a man with a gun. He fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen on live television. Oswald crumpled. Reporters screamed. Cameras caught it all. And with that, the accused assassin of John F. Kennedy was dead. Just 2 days after the president. Just like that, The chance for answers vanished. No trial, no confession, no explanation, only speculation and conspiracy. Jackie was in the White House making funeral arrangements when she heard. She did not cry. Instead, she simply said, "He didn't even have the satisfaction of being tried." And then she returned to planning what would become one of the most solemn state funerals in American history. On Monday, November 25th, John F. Kennedy's son's 3rd birthday, the nation came to a standstill. Shops closed, schools canceled classes, air traffic halted. The funeral began with a requiem mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral. Jackie wore a black veil. Bobby and Ted walked beside her. World leaders from more than 100 nations attended. Charles de Gaulle stood ramrod straight. Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, wore full dress. Prince Philip of England walked beside them in quiet solidarity. Outside the casket was placed on a horse-drawn caisson. The riderless horse, Blackjack, followed behind its stirrups, empty boots reversed. The sound of drums echoed down Pennsylvania Avenue as the procession moved slowly toward Arlington National Cemetery. Millions watched on TV. Silent. Still. They watched as the casket was lowered, as Jackie lit the eternal flame, as 3-year-old John Jr. stepped forward and gave a final salute. That image of a little boy saluting his fallen father would become one of the most haunting in American memory. People would remember where they were, in the grocery store, in math class, in a diner with the coffee still steaming. They would say, "I was at work when I heard," or "I came home and saw my mother crying in front of the television." It was the moment when time divided, before and after. For many, the grief was personal. It was not just that a president had died. It was that this president had died. The one with the young family, the war hero, the hopeful smile, the promise of a better tomorrow. The image of Camelot broken, and no one knew what would come next. The Cold War still loomed. Civil rights protests were heating up. Vietnam was building. But for one strange suspended week in November 1963, everything paused. The world did not turn quite the same. The air felt heavier. The future felt uncertain. And somewhere deep inside, a nation began to grieve, not just for a man, but for a version of itself that had vanished. The man with the rifle. He was 24 years old, thin, pale, a high forehead that made his face look longer than it was. His name had been broadcast across the country within hours of the shooting, but no one really knew who he was. Lee Harvey Oswald. Born in New Orleans in 1939, a few months before the start of World War II. His father died before he was born. His mother moved the family often. They never stayed long in one place. New Orleans, Dallas, Fort Worth. Back to New Orleans, back again. Teachers called him withdrawn, angry, prone to fantasy. He dropped out of high school, joined the Marines at 17. He qualified as a sharpshooter, but he struggled with authority. He read Marx, spoke in defense of communism, got court-martialed twice. In 1959, he did something few Americans had ever done. He defected. He went to the Soviet Union, wrote to the U.S. Embassy renouncing his citizenship, claimed he had information to give them. But the Soviets did not know what to do with him. Eventually, they gave him a factory job in Minsk, an apartment, a small life. He met a woman named Marina, married her, had a child. Then, strangely, he changed his mind. By 1962, Oswald applied to come back to the United States. The State Department approved it. Just like that, the boy who had defected to the enemy during the Cold War came home. To Texas. To a small apartment. A wife who spoke little English. A life of jobs and resentment and arguments. He handed out pro-Castro pamphlets. He was arrested in New Orleans for fighting with anti-Castro activists. He tried to go to Cuba, Tried to get a visa in Mexico City. It did not work. He returned to Dallas. He found work at the Texas School Book Depository in October 1963. And then, on the morning of November 22nd, he brought a rifle wrapped in brown paper to work. The rifle was a cheap Italian-made bolt-action, bought by mail under a false name. It cost him just under $20. That morning, the president's motorcade route had been published in the newspapers. Everyone knew he would be turning onto Elm Street, right past the book depository. Oswald worked on the 6th floor. Boxes of textbooks had been stacked near the window. It made a natural blind, a place to rest the rifle, 3 shots. That was all it took, and after that chaos. Oswald left the building, calmly by most accounts. He walked several blocks, caught a bus, switched to a taxi, went home, changed his clothes, picked up a revolver, and then, around 1:15 p.m., he encountered Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit. Accounts vary, but in the end, Tippit was shot 4 times. Oswald ran. He ducked into a movie theater, did not buy a ticket. An alert went out. The theater manager noticed him. Police arrived. There was a scuffle. A gun fired, but no one was hit. Oswald was arrested. The man accused of killing the president did not confess. Instead, he insisted he was just a patsy. That word would echo for decades. He was interrogated for 12 hours. No recordings, no full transcripts, just notes. He asked for legal representation, but none was assigned. He gave erratic answers, smiled sometimes, looked bored at others. The rifle was found in the building. Ballistics matched the bullets. His fingerprints were on the weapon. Witnesses placed him at the 6th floor window. To many the case seemed clear, but the speed of the events 2 days later, shot dead himself, left a vacuum. A silence that conspiracies rushed to fill. Why did he do it? Was he acting alone? Did someone else pull the strings? The Warren Commission would later conclude that Oswald acted alone. But to this day, the question lingers. He was not a mastermind. He was not wealthy. He was not connected to any major political group in any definitive way. He was just a man with a rifle, a man who once said he wanted to be something, a man who with 3 shots changed the course of a nation. Some believe he was driven by ideology. Others think it was loneliness. Some point to delusions of grandeur. Others think he was manipulated. But in the end, the only person who knew why was Oswald himself. And he took that knowledge to the grave on November 25th, the same day the president was laid to rest. His funeral was quiet. Few people came. Reporters were asked to act as pallbearers. No trumpet, no eternal flame, just wind through dead grass and a name etched on a stone. And so the story of Lee Harvey Oswald became something darker than a biography. It became a myth, a specter, a riddle without a solution. Because when someone so ordinary commits an act so enormous, it leaves a scar that facts alone cannot heal. The kind of scar that makes people whisper late at night. That keeps memories from settling. That reshapes the way a nation thinks about trust, about power, about safety. And in the silence after those 3 shots, America began to lose something it could never quite get back. The investigation begins. It was supposed to be the smooth transfer of grief into order. The president had been killed. The accused assassin had been caught. Now came the task of explanation, of stitching together something whole from the broken pieces. But things were never that simple. By the evening of November 22nd, the news had reached every home in America. Families ate in silence. Radios murmured in the background. Televisions flickered with images from Dealey Plaza, played over and over. The Zapruder film had not been shown yet. Only a handful of people had seen it, but even without it, people knew. Something had ruptured. In Dallas, Harvey Oswald sat in custody at the police headquarters. The interrogation lasted hours, no recording, just scribbled notes on yellow legal pads. Officers asked about the rifle, the revolver, his time in Russia, his time in Mexico, the flyers he had handed out. He gave answers, but they were vague. He seemed amused at times, annoyed at others. He denied everything. And then on Sunday morning, as police prepared to move him to the county jail, it happened. In the basement of the Dallas Police Building, as cameras rolled, a man stepped forward from the crowd. Jack Ruby. He was a nightclub owner, known to local cops, known to some reporters. He wore a dark suit and a fedora, and in a moment captured on live television, he raised a pistol and fired into Oswald's stomach. Gasps, screams, chaos. Oswald collapsed. He was rushed to the same hospital where Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. And just like that, he was gone. The man who might have answered the nation's questions would never speak again. And suddenly the uncertainty began to grow. Who was Jack Ruby? Why had he done it? He claimed he loved Kennedy, said he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a trial. He cried during questioning, spoke of patriotism. But many found his explanation hard to believe. He had ties to the Dallas underworld. He had connections. He moved in strange circles. And just like that, the idea of conspiracy bloomed. The government needed answers, fast. President Johnson, now in office only days, created the Warren Commission, named for Chief Justice Earl Warren. Its job to investigate the assassination, to bring clarity, and most importantly, to assure the American people that there was no larger threat. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, pored over thousands of documents, ballistics, autopsy reports, photographs, trajectories. They studied the rifle, the location of the 6th floor window, the angle of Elm Street, the timing of the shots. They called in experts, military marksmen, forensic specialists, pathologists. They examined the famous Zapruder film, frame by frame. And in 1964, less than a year after the shooting, they released their conclusion. Harvey Oswald acted alone. He fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. 1 missed. 1 struck both President Kennedy and Governor Connally. 1 was fatal. And Jack Ruby acted alone as well. Case closed, or so it was supposed to be. But for many Americans, something felt off. There were witnesses who said they heard shots from the grassy knoll. Others described hearing more than 3 shots. Some claimed to see smoke. Others heard echoes they could not explain. And the magic bullet, the one that supposedly struck both Kennedy and Connally and emerged relatively intact, became the centerpiece of doubt. Conspiracies took root. The CIA, the Mafia, anti-Castro Cubans, pro-Castro Cubans, the Soviets, the military-industrial complex, even Lyndon Johnson himself. Books were written, films were made, investigations reopened. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that there was likely a second shooter, that there may have been a conspiracy, but they could not say who was involved. The questions deepened. Why was the security so light in Dallas that day? Why did Oswald get his job at the book depository just weeks before? Why did Jack Ruby, of all people, manage to get into the basement with a loaded gun? Why were there no recordings of the Oswald interrogations? Why did the autopsy take place under rushed and poorly documented conditions? Every unanswered question was like a match to dry grass. And over the decades, those questions multiplied. In the 1990s, after the release of Oliver Stone's film, JFK, public pressure led to the creation of the Assassination Records Review Board. Thousands of documents were declassified, but still some files remained secret. Even today, not everything has been made public, and so the assassination of John F. Kennedy became more than just a moment in time. It became a puzzle, a mirror, a story we keep returning to, not just to understand what happened, but to ask what kind of nation we were becoming. Because at its heart, the assassination was not just a crime. It was a rupture in the American narrative. A loss of innocence, yes, but also a loss of faith in institutions, in transparency, in the idea that things happen for understandable reasons. When Oswald was killed on live television, it was like a curtain being yanked shut. The story could no longer be told cleanly. From then on, it would always have shadows. And in those shadows, America saw itself divided, suspicious, hungry for truth, but also unwilling to settle for simple answers, because maybe we did not just want the facts. Maybe we needed the mystery. Maybe the mystery was all we had left. The funeral of a nation. It rained softly in Washington the morning after the plane landed. Jackie Kennedy, still in her blood-stained pink suit, refused to change until the early hours. She had stayed that way on the flight back from Dallas, sitting next to the flag-draped coffin, refusing to let it out of her sight. Reporters said she looked like marble, silent, frozen, holding it together for the cameras, but gone behind the eyes. And now, the funeral had to be planned. In less than 72 hours, the entire machinery of the federal government was called into motion. Protocols were dusted off. State visits were rescheduled. Embassies flew flags at half-mast across the world. But more than that, the nation braced for a ritual it had not performed in a very long time: the burial of a sitting president. The last time had been Franklin Roosevelt, but he had died of illness in the quiet of Warm Springs. Kennedy had died on camera, in daylight, on a street, with witnesses. This was different. On November 24th, his body was laid in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Jackie walked beside it, holding the hands of her 2 children. John Jr. was nearly 3. Caroline was 6. People lined up for hours in the cold, black and white, old and young, soldiers in uniform, mothers with infants, men in suits and women in church hats. They stood in silence, snaking around the Capitol, waiting for a glimpse of the casket. It was a tidal wave of grief. Collective, raw, unfiltered. Over 250,000 people passed through the rotunda in a single day, and then came Monday, the state funeral. It was as if the entire world stopped breathing. Representatives from more than 90 countries came. Charles de Gaulle, Haile Selassie, Prince Philip, even Soviet Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan. For a moment, enemies stood side by side. The Cold War paused briefly out of respect. The funeral procession moved from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral. Jackie, in full black veil, walked alongside Robert and Ted Kennedy. Behind them, John Jr. in his coat saluted his father's casket as it passed by. The moment was caught by a photographer. That tiny salute would become one of the most haunting images in American history. A child saying goodbye to a father. A nation seeing itself in that child. The ceremony was solemn, with hymns and scripture and eulogies. But it was not the words people remembered. It was the walk. Jackie walking behind the caisson, led by a riderless black horse with boots turned backward in the stirrups. It was the silence of the crowds, the muffled drums, the sound of hooves on pavement. From the cathedral, the cortege made its way across the Potomac River to Arlington National Cemetery. That was Jackie's decision. She chose a hillside spot overlooking the city. From there you could see the Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol Dome, and even the White House on a clear day. The eternal flame was her idea too. She had seen one at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris. She thought it fitting that something stay lit no matter the wind. At the graveside, Robert Kennedy lit the flame. It flickered, then caught. A symbol that this man who had inspired a generation would not vanish completely into history. There were no fireworks, no speeches, just the sound of taps, the folding of the flag, and a final hush. Millions watched on television. Families huddled together in their living rooms. In factories, workers gathered around portable sets. In bars, strangers stood side by side in silence. It was one of the most watched broadcasts in history, because it was not just the funeral of a man. It was the funeral of a moment, the end of something believed in. The idea that youth and charm and intellect could protect us from the darkness, that a country as powerful as America could not be undone by a single bullet, that the future was still shining. After that Monday, things would be different. The grief gave way to questions. The silence turned into whispers. And slowly the country began to shift from belief to doubt, from innocence to caution. But in those hours of mourning, America was united. By shock, by sorrow, by the simple act of watching together. And for a fleeting moment under a gray November sky, the country stood still, not in fear, but in reverence. A nation on edge. The days after the funeral felt oddly quiet, like the country was holding its breath and did not quite know how to exhale. Washington returned to routine with mechanical politeness. Lyndon B. Johnson had moved into the White House. The wheels of government turned, but something had shifted subtly at first, then all at once. People began to talk, not just about grief anymore, about suspicion, because something about it did not sit right. A lone gunman with a bolt-action rifle firing from 6 floors up, hitting a moving target twice in a matter of seconds. The official story felt thin. In homes and coffee shops, barber shops, and break rooms, the conversations started circling. Was it really just Lee Harvey Oswald? He had been a Marine, defected to the Soviet Union, come back. Then 2 days after killing the president, he himself was shot dead on live television by a nightclub owner with mob connections. That was the moment the confusion tipped into paranoia. The man who shot him. Jack Ruby was no shadowy figure. He was well known in Dallas, ran strip clubs, was friendly with cops. And he just walked into the basement of the police station and killed Oswald, with cameras rolling surrounded by law enforcement. The country had not even finished burying Kennedy when the story began to crumble. The Warren Commission was created in November 1963 to find answers, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren himself. But what it delivered a year later was not reassurance. It concluded that Oswald had acted alone. No conspiracy, no second shooter. But Americans were no longer in the mood to believe. Not after seeing Zapruder's home movie of the assassination frame by frame. That head snap backward. That moment on Elm Street when time broke in two. The Zapruder film bought by Life magazine was not widely shown at the time, but word spread. And in hushed tones, people began to say what they thought, that there had to be more to it. Was it the Soviets, Castro, the CIA, the mob, even Lyndon Johnson? The era of conspiracy was born right there. Polls in the mid-1960s showed that more than half of Americans believed there was more than one gunman, that the government was hiding something. The tragedy had created a vacuum, and in it, theories poured in. And it did not stop at JFK. Over the next 5 years, more American icons would fall to bullets. Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Robert Kennedy just 2 months later. Each death added fuel to the fire. Each one chipped away at a sense of stability. Something felt broken in the country, but no one could agree on what exactly. And while the questions multiplied, other changes seeped into everyday life. Security around presidents transformed overnight. No more open convertibles. No more meandering public events without planning and layers of protection. The Secret Service grew adapted learned because it had failed. But the cultural shift went deeper than logistics. Trust eroded, not all at once, but steadily. Television, once the unifying hearth of the American home, began to reflect the unrest. News grew more urgent. Fiction grew darker. Art more cynical. The assassination was not just a political shock. It was a cultural fracture. Camelot had ended. The bright optimism of the early 1960s, with its dreams of space youth and progress, had dimmed. And in its place came something harder, more complicated, less trusting. The youth who had voted for Kennedy in 1960 were now students in Berkeley, protesting war and power. The middle-class parents who had cheered him on were now locking their doors, whispering about communists and riots. The music changed. The fashion changed. Even the way people looked at photographs changed. Black and white stills from Dealey Plaza now carried a ghostly weight, as if staring long enough might reveal a missing truth. And through it all, Jackie Kennedy stayed mostly silent. In her only major interview after the assassination, she spoke of his favorite song, Camelot, from the Broadway musical. She said, "There will never be another Camelot." And so the myth was born. Not just a man lost, but a world that could have been. The kind of myth that comforts and torments at the same time. Because if the dream was real, then the loss was unbearable. And if it was only a dream, then what did we ever believe in to begin with? The Zapruder Frame. There is a frame in that film, a single moment, blurry and brutal, that America would never quite be able to look away from. Frame 313. That was the one. The instant the fatal bullet struck President Kennedy's head, captured not by the government, not by the media, but by a dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder, standing on a pedestal with his Bell & Howell home movie camera. He had almost left the camera at home that morning. Thought maybe it would be too much trouble. But his secretary had urged him to bring it. So he did. And as the motorcade turned onto Elm Street, as the sun caught the glint of chrome on the convertible, Zapruder pressed the shutter. He was filming history. He did not know it yet. The Zapruder film is only 26 seconds long, just over 480 frames. But in those seconds you can see everything. The waving, the smiling, then a pause, a jolt, a hand reaching for the throat, another shot. Then frame 313, the president's head snaps backward and to the left, a spray. Jacqueline crawling onto the trunk, reaching for something, no one is sure what. Secret Service agent Clint Hill racing from the car behind, leaping onto the back of the limousine, shielding them both. It all happens in seconds, but frame 313 lives in slow motion. At first, the film was not shown to the public. Time Inc. bought it from Zapruder for $150,000, a staggering amount in 1963, and printed a few stills in Life magazine. The government had a copy, of course. The FBI studied it. The Warren Commission reviewed it. But for years, the public only heard whispers. Then, in 1975, it aired in full on national television for the first time on ABC's Goodnight America, hosted by Geraldo Rivera. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Americans watched many for the first time their president die in front of their eyes, not as a still photo, not in solemn recollection, but in motion. It shattered something, because that head snap did not match the official story. The Warren report said the shots came from behind, from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But frame 313 made it look like the shot came from the front. Conspiracy theories multiplied overnight. New phrases entered the vocabulary. Grassy knoll second shooter magic bullet. Oliver Stone's JFK movie in 1991 would take those theories mainstream, but their seeds were planted here in that grainy 8mm footage, shot by a man just trying to get a good view. Some scholars still debate what exactly the Zapruder film shows. Others argue the analysis of a single blurry frame can only tell us so much. But emotionally, the film changed everything. It was proof not just of what happened, but that it happened to us. The Kennedy assassination was the first American trauma captured in full-motion home video. The first time a citizen had filmed the unraveling of a nation's innocence. Before smartphones, before live streams, before the age of endless footage, there was Zapruder, and America would never watch violence the same way again. His camera became an unwilling witness, and with it, so did we all. For years afterward, people avoided watching it, or watched it obsessively, or argued about what it showed. Was that a puff of smoke near the fence? Was that someone moving in the shadows? The debate became part of the trauma, a nation trying to make sense of a single instant by watching it again and again. And Zapruder, he never wanted to be part of any of it. He broke down in tears when he handed the film to the Secret Service that afternoon. He had seen it with his own eyes. He had filmed it. And still, he could not believe it. In later years, he said, "I wish I had never taken that film." But he did. And now we all carry it. That frame, that blur, that echo. The Lone Gunman. He was not what people expected. Not a wild-eyed radical. Not a hardened criminal. Just a thin young man with a quiet face and a confused history. Lee Harvey Oswald, born October 18, 1939 in New Orleans. His father died before he was born. His mother moved the family constantly. New Orleans, Dallas, Fort Worth, the Bronx. Schools blurred together. So did the rules. He barely stayed long enough to make friends. He read a lot, spoke with an odd formality, kept to himself. In 1956, at 17, he joined the Marines, maybe to belong, maybe to escape. He qualified as a sharpshooter, not an expert but accurate enough. But something never quite fit. He studied Russian, declared himself a Marxist, got into fights, called himself a communist, while serving in the United States military. Eventually, he asked for a discharge. And then, in 1959, he did something few Americans ever had. He defected to the Soviet Union, showed up in Moscow just before his 20th birthday, told the U.S. Embassy he was renouncing his citizenship, declared that he wanted to live under communism. The Soviets were baffled. They watched him, questioned his motives. Eventually, they allowed him to stay not in Moscow, but in Minsk, in what is now Belarus. They gave him a job, an apartment, a small salary. For a while, he seemed to settle in. He married a local woman, Marina, had a daughter, lived in a concrete apartment building that still stands today. But he was never satisfied. By 1962, he was back in America, brought his wife and baby with him, settled in Texas. The dream, whatever it had been, was already fraying. He drifted from job to job, moved often, beat his wife, got into political arguments, joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro organization. He was 24 years old when he walked into the Texas School Book Depository on the morning of November 22, 1963, carrying a long package. He told a co-worker it was curtain rods. Later that day, President John F. Kennedy would be dead. When the police arrested Oswald that afternoon, he did not confess. He denied everything, told reporters he was just a patsy, and within 2 days, he was dead too. Shot on live television by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, which left America with no trial, no full confession, just a bullet a blur and a man we would never fully understand. The Warren Commission would later declare that Oswald acted alone, that he fired 3 shots from the 6th floor, that he killed a president by himself with no conspiracy, no accomplices, no greater plot. But few believed it then. Fewer believe it now, because Oswald seemed too small for the act, too unstable, too inconsistent. How could this rootless, restless man have changed the course of history? And yet, he did. He left behind a trail of contradictions. A man who read Marx but attended a right-wing rally. A soldier who defected to the Soviets but returned home. A husband, a father, a violent man, a ghost. His life reads like a riddle, and his death only deepened it. Even now we cannot quite decide who he was. Was he angry at the world, a believer in something, a man desperate to be seen, or just a man who stood in a window and pulled a trigger because no one stopped him? We may never know. But we do know this: however small he seemed, however silent he remained, Lee Harvey Oswald changed everything. With a $21 rifle and 5.6 seconds of gunfire, he froze history, and America has been trying to unfreeze it ever since. Jack Ruby and the silencing. It was supposed to be a simple transfer, a handoff from the Dallas City Jail to the county facility. A standard procedure surrounded by reporters and cameras, because the suspect was not just any man. He was the man accused of murdering the President of the United States. Lee Harvey Oswald had not yet stood trial, had not spoken under oath, had not explained his reasons. America was still holding its breath. And then Jack Ruby pulled the trigger. It was November 24, 1963, just 2 days after the assassination. A Sunday morning. A nation still stunned televisions, still tuned in, still reeling from disbelief. In the basement garage of the Dallas Police Headquarters, Oswald emerged in handcuffs flanked by detectives. He wore a dark sweater, looked dazed. The cameras rolled, reporters shouted, and then from the crowd, a man stepped forward. Ruby. He raised a revolver and fired 1 shot into Oswald's abdomen. The sound echoed. Oswald gasped, collapsed. A detective shouted, "He's been shot," as chaos erupted on live television. Millions watched it unfold in real time. A man dying before their eyes. The accused assassin of a president silenced before he could speak a word of truth. For a country already lost in grief, it was now lost in suspicion. Who was Jack Ruby, a 52-year-old nightclub owner in Dallas? Born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago, raised poor, drifting through odd jobs and street fights. He changed his name, ran dance halls, knew the cops knew the girls ran in strange circles. Not quite a gangster, but not quite clean either. He was known to the Dallas police. A man who flashed a badge and thought himself important, who brought sandwiches to the officers, who wandered the station at all hours. How did he even get into that garage? The official story was that Ruby had left his dog in the car and walked in through the unlocked ramp. But it made no sense. The police were on alert. Oswald was the most guarded man in the country. And yet somehow, a local club owner with a gun had stood just feet from him, and no one stopped him. Ruby was tackled immediately, arrested on the spot. He claimed he did it to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of a trial, that he wanted to avenge the president, that it was patriotic. But few believed him, because his actions raised more questions than answers. Had he known Oswald? Had he been part of something larger? Did someone send him to keep Oswald quiet? The conspiracy theories multiplied overnight, and without Oswald, the hole in the truth only deepened. Ruby's trial was quick and chaotic. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But he appealed, claimed he had been set up, claimed he was dying of cancer, claimed he would reveal more if only he could be moved to Washington. He died in prison in January 1967 of a pulmonary embolism secondary to lung cancer. He never told us more, and so America lost the chance to ever hear from Oswald himself. 2 men, 2 deaths, 3 days apart. The man who shot the president. The man who shot the man who shot the president. And a nation left with silent shadows and a gnawing uncertainty that would never quite go away. Because Jack Ruby did not just kill a man. He killed the only witness who might have explained it all. A nation grieves on live television. It was the morning of November 25th, 1963, cold, gray, solemn, the day John F. Kennedy was laid to rest. In homes across America, the televisions flickered to life. No cartoons, no commercials, just silence and mourning. 3 days had passed since the shots in Dealey Plaza, and still the nation felt suspended in a strange, aching pause. Washington, D.C. was hushed that morning, the Capitol draped in black flags at half-staff military bands, playing funeral dirges that barely rose above a whisper. The president's body had lain in state in the Capitol Rotunda for 24 hours. Over 250,000 people had filed past his flag-draped casket. Some waited all night in the cold just to say goodbye. Now the casket was being moved. A horse-drawn caisson led by a riderless black horse named Blackjack, with reversed boots in the stirrups, the traditional symbol of a fallen leader. Just behind Jacqueline Kennedy walked with her children. John Jr. was about to turn 3. Caroline 5.5. The First Lady wore a long black veil, her face expressionless, her steps steady. She had planned this funeral herself, every detail, every movement. The procession wound slowly through Washington from the Capitol to the White House and then to St. Matthew's Cathedral. The world watched. Cameras followed every step. It was not just a funeral. It was a shared ritual of grief for an entire people. Inside the cathedral, diplomats and dignitaries filled the pews. Presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens. Charles de Gaulle from France. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Prince Philip of the United Kingdom. Leaders from over 90 countries came to honor the fallen American president. It was the largest gathering of world leaders since World War II. And yet, for all its grandeur, the funeral felt deeply intimate. The image that burned into America's collective memory was not the eulogies, not the salutes, but a tiny gesture. As the casket was carried out of the church, young John F. Kennedy Jr., dressed in a pale blue coat and shorts, stepped forward and gave a small salute. It lasted just a second, but it shattered the nation's composure. It was raw. It was real. The son saluting his father, a little boy saying goodbye to someone the whole country had lost. That image was printed in newspapers the next day, hung on refrigerators tucked into photo albums. It became part of the nation's soul. Later that afternoon at Arlington National Cemetery, Kennedy was buried with full military honors, a 21-gun salute, the playing of taps, the folding of the flag, and finally Jacqueline Kennedy lit an eternal flame, a symbol that her husband's legacy would never be extinguished. It was a moment soaked in symbolism, the flame flickering against the winter dusk, as if to say that even in the darkest hours, the light of hope or history or memory might still survive. Across the country, millions cried, even those who had never voted for him, even those who barely followed politics, because it was not just a president who had died. It was the idea that America could be young, hopeful, and fearless, that it could choose vision over fear, and that its leaders, however imperfect, might still inspire greatness. That day, America buried a man, but it also buried something less visible, a sense of certainty, of innocence, of future imagined. And for many, life would never feel quite the same again. Johnson takes the oath and the reins of a shattered nation. It was still November 22nd, 1963, just a little after 2:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Aboard Air Force One, sitting on the tarmac at Love Field in Dallas, Lyndon Baines. Johnson stood silently in the tight cabin. To his left stood Jacqueline Kennedy, her pink suit still stained with blood. To his right, Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes held out the small black Bible. There were reporters, Secret Service aides pressed shoulder to shoulder. And in the stillness, Johnson raised his right hand and took the oath of office. It was the first and only time a president of the United States was sworn in by a woman. It was also the first time a presidential inauguration had ever taken place aboard an airplane. The photograph taken in that crowded cabin would become iconic. Johnson solemn, composed. Jackie dazed, but standing firm. History had no time to prepare a stage. It simply happened right there, with grief in the air and engines rumbling in the background. Less than 2 hours after the assassination, America had a new president. But this was no triumph, no jubilant oath. Johnson had inherited power through death, not election. The moment felt surreal, like stepping into a stranger's shoes while they were still warm. Johnson's first speech as president was brief, spoken to the press on the steps of the plane before it lifted off. "This is a sad time for all people," he said. "I will do my best. That is all I can do." No grand promises, no rhetoric, just the stark weight of responsibility. The flight back to Washington was silent. Jacqueline Kennedy refused to change out of her blood-stained clothes. She sat beside the coffin, which had been hastily loaded into the rear of the plane after Air Force One was retrofitted to carry it. Secret Service agents and aides stood quietly nearby. Everyone knew the country was watching, every move, every moment. In the days that followed, Johnson moved swiftly. He addressed Congress on November 27th in a speech carefully crafted to reassure a shaken nation. He declared, "Let us carry forward the plans and programs of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, not because of our sorrow or sympathy, but because they are right." It was his way of claiming continuity. But he was also a different man. Where Kennedy had been cool and eloquent, Johnson was earthy and imposing. He knew Congress better than any man alive. He knew how to twist arms, cut deals, move votes. And he would use that knowledge to pass civil rights legislation, to launch the Great Society, to escalate the war in Vietnam. But on that day, and for weeks after Johnson governed in a kind of shadow, people mourned the president they had lost, and they eyed the one they now had with caution, even suspicion. Johnson had been seen as the political opposite of Kennedy's glamour. Older, Southern, more backroom than ballroom. He knew this, and for a time, he let the mourning take the lead. He stepped carefully. He quoted Kennedy often. He made few abrupt moves. He understood that power in a democracy must be accepted, not just transferred. And in the vacuum left by Kennedy's death, America had not yet fully accepted anyone. Behind the scenes, Johnson worried about the economy, about civil rights, about the Soviet reaction, but mostly about the future of a country that had seen its leader murdered in daylight. He was now the steward of a grieving nation, and history was watching to see what he would do next. Oswald in custody, a frenzied search for answers. By the evening of November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was no longer just a name. He was the man in custody, the man accused of killing a president. The Dallas police had him locked in a small windowless room in the basement of the city jail. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A fan hummed in the corner, and outside hundreds of reporters gathered shouting questions through the stairwells, their flashbulbs ready for any glimpse of the alleged assassin. Inside, it was chaos. Oswald, just 24 years old, sat stiffly. His face was pale but calm. He had a faint bruise on his left eye from the scuffle during his arrest. He wore a white t-shirt beneath a rumpled button-down. For hours, detectives took turns questioning him, trying to get straight answers. He denied everything. "I didn't shoot anybody," he said. "I don't know what this is all about." He claimed he was just a patsy, a word that stuck in the public imagination. A patsy, but the evidence was stacking up. The rifle found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository had been ordered by Oswald under the name A. Hidell. His palm print was on the barrel. Witnesses had seen a man matching his description in the building just before the shots were fired. And then there was Officer J.D. Tippett. At 1:16 p.m., Tippett had approached a man matching Oswald's description in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. Less than a minute later, Tippett lay dead on the pavement, shot 4 times. Several witnesses later identified Oswald as the shooter. Oswald had fled into the Texas theater without paying. That was how he got caught. The irony of a presidential assassin being apprehended for sneaking into a movie became one of those strange details that history never forgets. At the station, the media frenzy was like nothing the Dallas police had ever seen. They tried to move Oswald discreetly, but every hallway was crowded. Reporters screamed. Cameras flashed. Police officers, visibly nervous, tried to maintain order, but there was none to be had. That night, Oswald was formally charged with the murder of Officer Tippett. Then, at 1:30 a.m. on November 23rd, he was charged with the assassination of President Kennedy. Still, he insisted on his innocence. "I want legal representation," he said. "I want someone to come forward and give me legal assistance." But no lawyer came. Not then. Over the next 24 hours, the questions deepened. Why had Oswald traveled to the Soviet Union in 1959 and returned in 1962? Why had he tried to defect? Was he part of something larger, a plot of foreign conspiracy? Or was he just a lone drifter with a rifle and a twisted sense of destiny? The CIA, FBI, and Secret Service scrambled to share what they knew, or perhaps what they should have known. Files were reviewed, memos rushed between offices. Oswald had been watched before, but never closely enough. He had written to the Soviet embassy. He had shown up at pro-Castro rallies. And now, the president was dead. There was a gnawing fear. Had America let this happen right under its nose? In the public's mind, the pieces didn't fit. How could this odd young man, no wealth, no power, no army, bring down the leader of the free world? With a mail-order rifle, Dallas police promised a full investigation. But the truth was, they were overwhelmed, undertrained for something this enormous, afraid of making the wrong move, and worse, afraid someone might silence Oswald before he could talk. As Saturday morning came, Oswald asked again for legal counsel. He would not get the chance to use it. But for now, in that tiny police cell, history was suspended, holding its breath. The accused killer of the President of the United States sat waiting, surrounded by suspicion's silence and the rumble of a country still in shock. And outside, the world was watching every step. Sunday morning 1. Gunshot, Jack Ruby, enters history. The morning of November 24th, 1963 began cold and overcast in Dallas. 2 days had passed since President Kennedy was shot. Americans were still grieving, still watching their televisions in disbelief, still trying to process a moment that had fractured the country's sense of security. In the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters, preparations were underway for a prisoner transfer. Lee Harvey Oswald was set to be moved to the county jail. The press had been alerted. Cameras were rolling. Police were edgy. There had been threats against Oswald's life, and though no one took them too seriously, there was a general sense of unease. At around 11:20 a.m., Oswald was led through the narrow basement corridor. He wore a dark sweater over a white shirt, his hands cuffed in front of him. 2 detectives flanked him. Ahead, the armored car waited. Then, in a split second, everything changed again. A man lunged forward from the crowd. He raised a small revolver and fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen. Chaos. Screams echoed through the underground garage. Officers tackled the shooter. Oswald crumpled to the ground, gasping. The image Oswald's face contorted in pain. The gun still visible in the frame was broadcast live to millions of Americans. The shooter's name was Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, a man known to the Dallas police, a familiar face at the station actually. He had a temper, he carried a gun, and that morning he had somehow slipped through the security perimeter with a loaded revolver tucked into his coat. In the hours that followed, everything grew murkier. Ruby claimed he had acted out of patriotism. He said he had been devastated by Kennedy's death and wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of seeing Oswald go to trial. But the public and the press were not convinced. How had Ruby gotten in? Why had there been so little security? And most of all, had Ruby acted alone? Oswald was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. He was taken into emergency surgery, but pronounced dead at 1:07 p.m. The man who might have explained it all was gone, and with him 1,000 unanswered questions. President Kennedy's assassin had been silenced on live television. Before any trial, before any official confession, before any clarity could emerge. And so the conspiracy theories were born, not months later, not years, but instantly. Was Ruby part of the mob? Did he know Oswald was someone cleaning up loose ends? In Washington, officials scrambled. The FBI accelerated its investigation. The newly sworn-in President Lyndon B. Johnson was briefed hourly, and the public watched stunned as America entered a new kind of uncertainty, one where even the alleged assassin could not be safely kept alive. Later that day, Johnson made a quiet decision that would shape the legacy of that weekend. He appointed a commission to investigate the entire affair. It would be chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren. But already doubt was settling in like a fog. 2 days earlier, the world had seen a president gunned down in the sunlight. Now they had seen his accused killer shot on live TV. And the question that began to haunt every American was not just, who killed Kennedy, but will we ever really know? The Warren Commission. A nation tries to understand. By early December 1963, the nation was desperate for answers, not just about who pulled the trigger in Dealey Plaza, but why, how, and whether they had acted alone. President Lyndon B. Johnson, barely 2 weeks into the most difficult job in the world, understood this unease. He also understood that chaos could not be allowed to settle into the foundations of American life. On November 29th, he announced the formation of a special commission to investigate every detail of the assassination. It would be led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, a man respected across the political spectrum. Alongside him were senators, representatives, former CIA and military leaders, including future President Gerald Ford and former CIA Director Allen Dulles. Thus was born the Warren Commission. Their mission to find the truth and to do it quickly, publicly, and with credibility. The task was monumental. They combed through thousands of documents, photographs, interviews. Over 10 months, They heard from 552 witnesses, reviewed ballistic evidence, rewatched the Zapruder film frame by frame, and wrestled with inconsistencies that seemed to multiply the deeper they looked. One name came up again and again: Lee Harvey Oswald. The commission traced his past, his time in the Marines, his defection to the Soviet Union in 1959, his return to the United States in 1962, with a Russian wife and growing bitterness toward the government. He had handed out pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans, attempted to kill General Edwin Walker earlier that year, and was known for volatile outbursts. A man of sharp intelligence and scattered ideology, Oswald seemed driven more by anger than clear politics. But what about Jack Ruby? The commission dug into his life, too. His nightclub business, his connections with police, his short fuse, and the moment he pulled the trigger that silenced Oswald forever. Was Ruby sent by someone? Was he tied to organized crime? In September 1964, the commission released its final report, 888 pages long. Its central conclusion was simple, and for many devastating: Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Jack Ruby, too, acted alone. There had been no broader conspiracy, no foreign plot, no inside job, no second gunman. The commission explained Oswald's motives as personal and ideological, not orchestrated. It detailed the lack of security, the chain of events, and the forensic evidence. The single bullet theory that one shot had wounded both President Kennedy and Governor Connally was key to this narrative. So was the trajectory of bullets from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But as soon as the report was published, the questions only deepened. Many Americans could not believe it. How could such a seismic tragedy be the work of one disaffected man with a rifle? How could Jack Ruby just happen to walk into the police basement at the perfect moment? Why were there conflicting witness accounts, strange autopsy details, withheld documents? The disbelief was not just about evidence. It was emotional. This was the death of a young, vibrant president in broad daylight, in front of cameras with millions watching. And the official story, however detailed, felt too simple for the scale of the loss. Over the years, more commissions would revisit the events, most notably in 1979, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded there was a probable conspiracy. But the Warren Report remained the official record. Chief Justice Warren himself would later say he believed the findings were correct, but that he understood why the public remained unsettled. Because in some way, this was not just about facts. It was about faith in institutions, in safety, in America's story. And that faith had been shaken. A country forever changed, from Dallas to Vietnam and beyond. The death of John F. Kennedy did not just remove a man from office. It altered the current of American history in ways both immediate and slow, burning subtle and seismic. In the days following the assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson moved swiftly. He kept Kennedy's cabinet largely intact. He pushed for stability. He stood before Congress on November 27th, just 5 days after the shooting, and told the American people, "Let us continue." The phrase would define his presidency, but continuing was not so simple. The Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had proposed was still stalled. Johnson, a master of legislative maneuvering, would push it through in 1964. Then came Medicare, Medicaid, and the sweeping reforms of the Great Society. In many ways, Johnson advanced more of Kennedy's domestic goals than Kennedy himself had time to achieve. But foreign policy was another matter. Kennedy had been wary of deepening America's involvement in Vietnam. He had sent military advisors, yes, and allowed for aid and training. But in private, he had expressed doubts. Some of his top aides believed he would have withdrawn troops after the 1964 election. That decision, of course, never came. Johnson inherited the quagmire and chose escalation. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident gave him the pretext. Soon, American troop levels would soar. By 1968, over 500,000 Americans were deployed in Vietnam. The war would divide the nation fuel protest and shatter the public's trust in government. Would Kennedy have done the same? Historians still debate it. But after Dallas, the country's trajectory veered sharply into conflict and a different vision of American power. Culturally, too, something had shifted. The 1960s before Kennedy's death, and after feel like two different decades. The early years had a sleek optimism. Camelot, they called it. A young family in the White House. Televised charm. Modern America full of promise. Afterward came something darker. The Beatles arrived. Protests swelled. Cities burned. Malcolm X was killed in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Robert Kennedy, too, shot in a hotel kitchen, just like his brother had been gunned down in a motorcade. Hope bled into cynicism. Trust gave way to suspicion. It is not that Kennedy was perfect. He was far from it. He had made mistakes in Cuba in personal affairs, in early policy missteps. But he was young, eloquent, and symbolized a generational shift. His death was not just tragic. It was disorienting, like waking up in a country that no longer knew where it was headed. For many Americans, that confusion never quite faded. Even today, people remember exactly where they were when they heard the news. In a classroom, at a gas station, on a factory floor, radios buzzing, women weeping, men staring into nothing. It was one of those rare moments when time freezes, like Pearl Harbor, like 9/11. And in the freeze, something essential slips away. By the 1970s, Watergate would rip further into the public's faith. The Warren Report would be questioned in film literature, whispered theories. Trust in government, once a quiet given, became an active debate. Perhaps the biggest change was psychological. America had believed it was safe, protected by oceans, guided by destiny. Kennedy's assassination pierced that belief. It made Americans look over their shoulders, at their own institutions, at each other. The shots fired in Dallas echoed far beyond Dealey Plaza. They reshaped how America saw itself and how it moved through the rest of the century. The myths, the theories, and the echoes that never fade. Some say the moment the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, America lost not just its president, but its innocence. But innocence is a complicated thing. What truly evaporated that day was certainty. Trust in the official story. Faith in institutions. The belief that history moved in a straight line. From almost the very beginning, there were doubts. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, that one of those bullets, the so-called magic bullet, wounded both Kennedy and Governor Connally, that Jack Ruby, in a moment of grief or madness, killed Oswald 2 days later on live television to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of a public trial. And yet, very few believed it, even at the time. By 1966, a Gallup poll showed that more than half of Americans believed there had been a conspiracy, and over the decades, that number only grew. People asked questions that did not have satisfying answers. Why did Ruby, a small-time nightclub owner with mob connections, really kill Oswald? Why were witnesses' accounts so inconsistent? Why did the FBI and CIA withhold documents, redact reports, refuse to testify fully? Why did the Zapruder film show Kennedy's head snapping back if the shots came from behind? Theories bloomed like wildflowers or weeds depending on who you asked. The Mafia, the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, pro-Castro Cubans, Soviet agents, right-wing extremists, Lyndon Johnson, military industrialists, even the Secret Service itself. Each theory had its believers, its books, its documentaries. Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK sent a new generation into the rabbit hole. But the truth, if it exists in one tidy shape, remains elusive. What is clear is that the government's handling of the investigation, secretive, rushed, and dismissive, only deepened the mistrust. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s reversed the Lone Gunman finding and said probably a conspiracy. But still no clear answers, only layers of fog. For some, that uncertainty became an obsession. People pored over photographs, analyzed sound recordings, debated trajectories and timelines. The grassy knoll became as famous as the White House lawn. Dealey Plaza, once just a sun-baked patch of Dallas, became a pilgrimage site. Some came to mourn, others came to measure shadows. And yet beneath all the theories and angles and analysis, there was always something simpler and sadder. A young president was shot, in broad daylight, in front of his wife, and the country, in watching him die, lost something beyond explanation. A sense that history made sense, that tragedies had clear authors, that the future could be predicted. Even now, every few years, a new batch of documents is declassified. Files from the CIA, notes from the FBI, memoirs from those close to the events. But rather than settle anything, they often stir up more doubt. Maybe because the human mind recoils from randomness. The idea that one man with a cheap rifle could alter the course of a global superpower. It feels unbearable. In our bones, we long for deeper reasons, for grand schemes, for a villain worthy of the chaos. But history cruelly does not always cooperate. The echoes of that November afternoon still bounce through our culture, through art, politics, even comedy. Children ask their grandparents where they were. Conspiracy forums still light up every anniversary. The motorcade plays on endless loop. And that final moment, the wave, the smile, the shock still feels unreal. Because in some ways, it always will. Good night, Mr. President. Sometimes when the world is quiet and the hour grows late, I still think about that afternoon in Dallas. Not because I was there, I was not. But because somehow, in every telling, in every photograph, in every second of that grainy Zapruder film, it still feels close, as if the moment has never quite ended, as if we are all still sitting there holding our breath. It was November 22nd, 1963, a Friday, just after noon, and in the blink of an eye something cracked in the American story. Not just a bullet, not just a life, but a trust, a rhythm, a sense that time was moving forward in an orderly way. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was 46 years old. He had a young family, a vision of a new frontier, a belief in words, in youth, in possibility. And then, he was gone. That weekend, the nation did not sleep. Not really. People wandered into churches, sat by radios, stared blankly at televisions. They watched as his flag-draped casket rolled through Washington accompanied by a riderless horse and a little boy saluting his father. The world kept turning, but slower, dimmer. There is a particular ache that comes when history refuses to explain itself, when the stories we tell ourselves about fairness, justice, logic fall away. All that remains is the silence that follows the shot. And yet somehow, from that silence, something still lingers. It is not just sadness. It is memory, a collective one, shared by millions who never met the man, but who still feel the chill of that day. Over the decades, America has changed in 1,000 ways. The music, the politics, the skyline, the wars. But that moment in Dealey Plaza remains suspended, untouched by time. Because grief does not always age. Some memories refuse to fade. We do not all agree on what happened. We may never. The evidence is fragmented, the motives muddy, the witnesses flawed, but the feeling, that strange, still ache that remains. And maybe that is its own kind of truth. In a way, it does not matter where the shots came from, or how many, or why. What matters is what came after. The way a nation picked up the pieces. The way we remember not just the tragedy, but the person, the laughter, the promise. The way he once looked into a camera and asked us not to ask what our country could do for us. That voice, that face, that moment. Frozen. So tonight, if you find yourself thinking of him, the young man with the Boston accent, the wind in his hair, the weight of the world on his shoulders, you are not alone. Many of us do, because some stories are too big to finish. They echo gently in the corners of our lives, and every once in a while they whisper something soft, something unfinished. Good night, Mr. President. We remember. We still remember.